He was just looking for a place to wait out the rain when he stumbled upon an old abandoned auto shop. But what he built inside changed not only his life, it changed the entire town forever. Subscribe to the channel and be sure to tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The rain had been falling since morning, a thin, relentless sheet that blurred the horizon and turned the cracked asphalt into a dull ribbon of gray. Michael Reed gripped the steering wheel of his old Ford pickup as another gust of wind slammed against the cab. The wipers squeaked and hesitated, barely keeping up with the downpour. His breath fogged the glass. Somewhere behind the endless rain, the sun was still there, but it hadn't touched this part of the state for days. The gas gauge hovered just above empty, and the engine coughed, warning him that the road ahead was about to run out for both of them. He had been living out of that truck for the better part of 3 years. The passenger seat served as a pantry, the back as a wardrobe, and the glove compartment as his safe. His last name still meant something in a few small towns scattered across the Midwest. Reed Auto Repair had once been a place where people trusted their cars and left with a smile. But those days were gone. His wife, Claire, had been sick for too long, and the money had bled out faster than the hope. After selling the house, the shop, and most of his equipment, there had been nothing left but debt and the gnawing silence of loss. When she died, something inside him broke, quietly, like a spring snapping deep in an engine. He stopped fighting, stopped calling his son, stopped expecting anything from tomorrow. Now he simply drifted between small towns, offering his skills in exchange for cash or a hot meal. He'd fix a water pump at a gas station, a timing belt behind a diner, patch a roof if he had to. When work was done, he'd drive until the road felt unfamiliar again. He never stayed long. People had a way of asking questions that scraped old wounds open. That night, the rain grew heavier, and the pickup began to sputter with every incline. The fuel pump was dying, a cruel joke from a truck that had carried him like a home. Michael muttered under his breath, coaxing the vehicle forward, but when it jerked twice and lost speed, he eased it onto the shoulder of a forgotten back road. The storm drummed on the hood. He killed the engine, exhaled, and let the sound of the rain fill the silence. Through the watery haze, he saw a narrow dirt path veer off to the right. A faded sign leaned sideways, too dark to read. With nothing to lose, he grabbed his duffel bag and a flashlight and started down that path, boots splashing through puddles. The road curved between overgrown fields, leading him past collapsed barns and rusted vehicles buried in grass. The air smelled of oil and wet soil, an old scent that stirred something inside him. Memory, or maybe just longing. After about 10 minutes of walking, his flashlight caught the glint of metal. There, half hidden behind a wall of weeds, stood a brick building with a wide garage door and the ghost of a neon sign above it. The paint was nearly gone, but he could still make out the faded letters. Riverside Auto, since 1954. The sign swayed slightly in the wind, its frame creaking like tired bones. Michael stopped. The sight of it, those familiar proportions, the outline of a lift door, the faint shape of an oil drum hit him like a photograph from another life. He approached slowly, wiping the rain from his brow, and tried the handle of a side door. It resisted, swollen from years of moisture, but a firm shove sent it groaning open. The smell that greeted him was thick and heavy, dust, metal, and old grease. Inside, darkness reigned, broken only by the narrow cone of his flashlight. It revealed a cavernous space, cluttered but strangely preserved. Workbenches lined the walls, still holding wrenches and sockets in neat rows, as if the mechanic had just stepped out for lunch. A chalkboard carried half-faded notes, order belts for Buick, check carburetor on Johnson's Chevy. In one corner stood the rusted skeleton of a Ford pickup, its hood open, engine half dismantled. On a shelf above it, a coffee mug had petrified into stone. Michael walked through the space as carefully as if it were sacred ground. Every object whispered of a past rhythm, the hum of compressors, the chatter of customers, the clang of a dropped wrench. The roof, though old, held steady against the rain, and there was no standing water inside. Whoever built this place had done it right. He found an old metal chair, brushed the dust off, and sat. For the first time in weeks, he felt dry. He decided to stay the night. There was an old iron stove in the corner, the kind mechanics once used to heat the place in winter. After a few tries, he managed to clear its vent and feed it a handful of dry scraps from a broken crate. The smoke rose cleanly through the pipe. The orange glow felt like a heartbeat in the dark. The next morning brought a gray dawn and silence. He scavenged through the tool cabinets, driven partly by curiosity, partly by habit. There was more left here than he expected. Socket sets, tire gauges, old spark plugs still in their boxes. Everything was aged but serviceable. In the back room, he found a small generator under a tarp, its casing spotted with rust. He examined it, checked the filter, drained the sludge from its tank, and poured in the last of his truck's gasoline. On the third pull, it coughed and rumbled to life. The lights flickered on, weak but steady. For a moment he just stood there, staring at the sudden brightness. The pale bulbs illuminated the entire shop, every scar on the concrete floor, every stain on the workbench. The place looked alive again, breathing faintly after a long sleep. Michael smiled a small, crooked smile that surprised even him. He hadn't smiled in months. He spent the day cleaning. He swept the dust, stacked the tools, patched a hole in the wall with scrap metal. He found an old cot folded in the storage room, dragged it into a corner, and covered it with his blanket. The rhythm of work filled him with a quiet energy. Every repaired hinge, every tightened bolt was a small piece of order restored to the world. Late in the afternoon, while clearing a drawer, he discovered a leather-bound notebook. Its cover was cracked and brittle, but inside, the handwriting was firm and confident. B. Langley, the first page read. The name meant nothing to him, but the entries did. They weren't ledgers or repair lists. They were fragments of a life. Notes about customers, jokes shared between friends, mentions of local kids hanging around to watch the mechanics work. One entry caught his eye. The garage is more than a shop. It's a place where people fix things that aren't engines. Michael closed the book slowly. He understood what Langley meant. His own shop had been that way once, before the world narrowed to loss and silence. For a moment he felt something stir deep in his chest, not quite hope, but the faint echo of it. He wondered what happened to Langley, whether he left town or simply grew old and vanished. The thought of death didn't frighten Michael anymore. What frightened him was being forgotten. As the light faded, he stepped outside. The rain had stopped, and the sky was turning a soft purple. The river glimmered beyond the weeds. The air was cold but clean, and for the first time in years he didn't feel entirely alone. The building behind him looked tired but proud, its bricks darkened with age yet still standing straight. He thought about painting the sign again, just enough to make it legible. That night he cooked a can of beans on the stove, sitting beside the dim glow of the bulb powered by his stubborn little generator. The warmth seeped into his bones. He hadn't planned to stay here beyond a night, but something about the place's silence, its dignity, made him hesitate. Maybe he could fix the roof tomorrow. Maybe patch the window. It wasn't a plan, just an instinct, but it felt better than running. Days began to blend together. He cleaned, sorted, repaired. He drained the oil from the old Ford in the corner just to see if the engine was salvageable. He patched the leaks in the ceiling with tin sheets from the shed. When he looked at his hands, smeared with grease and dust, he no longer saw a vagrant. He saw a mechanic again. One evening, as he stood by the open doorway watching the road shimmer with leftover rain, He heard an engine in the distance. A pair of headlights approached slowly along the dirt path. The sound grew louder until a pickup pulled into the lot, tires crunching over gravel. Michael squinted, shielding his eyes. The truck stopped in front of the garage. For a moment, the driver just sat there, the beams cutting through the darkness, illuminating the cracked sign above the door. Then the engine shut off and the lights faded. The door opened with a creak, and a man stepped out, a solid figure in a worn army jacket, his breath steaming in the cool air. Michael's pulse quickened. No one had come here in years, maybe decades. He wondered if he was trespassing, if this man was the owner or a neighbor come to chase him off. The stranger looked around the yard, then at the glowing window. "Well," the man said, his voice low and surprised, "I'll be damned. I never thought I'd see this place lit up again." Michael froze where he stood, unsure whether to answer or retreat. The man took a few steps closer, studying him under the flicker of the hanging bulb. There was no hostility in his eyes, only disbelief and something else memory, perhaps. "Didn't think anyone would ever bother fixing this dump," the man murmured. "Used to bring my truck here, back when Ben Langley ran it. That was a long time ago." Michael's throat felt dry. He hadn't heard the name spoken aloud since reading it in the notebook. The man extended a hand. "Name's Tom Brady. Folks around here thought this place was dead." He glanced past Michael at the faintly glowing interior. "Guess they were wrong." Michael hesitated, then took his hand. It was rough, warm, real. Tom looked him straight in the eye and smiled faintly. "You fixing it up or just hiding from the rain?" Michael didn't know what to say. Maybe both. Maybe neither. He only knew one thing for certain. The moment he turned the light on inside this forgotten garage, something had started turning back on inside him too. The rain had stopped completely now. The world outside was still and waiting. In the reflection of the window, Michael saw the faint glow of the sign above the door, letters half erased by time, Riverside Auto. And beneath that glow stood two men, one who had come back by chance, another who didn't yet know he had just begun to come back to life. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the road, another engine stirred, faint and distant. The night felt full of possibilities. And for the first time in years, Michael Reed didn't feel like he was driving toward nowhere anymore. He was home, though he didn't yet realize it. The morning after Tom Brady's visit broke cold and blue. Mist clung to the wet fields, and the world felt strangely awake, as though it too had noticed the light from the garage and wanted to see what it meant. Michael stepped outside, rubbing his arms against the chill, and saw tire tracks in the mud where Tom's truck had been. The rain had washed most of them away, but the faint lines remained, a quiet reminder that someone had found him, that he wasn't entirely invisible anymore. Inside, the smell of oil and steel greeted him like an old friend. The generator sputtered weakly to life, and one by one the lights came on, flickering across the room like memories stirring. He had spent much of the night turning over Tom's words in his head. "Used to bring my truck here when Ben Langley ran it." That name, that notebook, the ghosts of laughter between those walls, it all pressed against him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Around mid-morning he heard the familiar crunch of tires again. Another truck rolled up, this one older, its hood held down by a strip of wire. The driver climbed out, a man in a denim jacket with hands rough from years in the fields. He introduced himself as Carl, said he'd heard from Tom that the old Riverside Auto was open again, or at least half alive. He asked if Michael could take a look at the engine. It had been sputtering for months. Michael didn't argue or explain that he wasn't really open, that he was just a man sleeping among rust and dust. He simply nodded and lifted the hood. The work came back like instinct, the rhythm of diagnosis, the soft language of machinery. Within an hour, the engine purred like a cat, smoother than it had in years. Carl offered cash, but Michael shook his head. Just glad to see something working again, he said. By afternoon, Carl was gone, and silence returned to the garage. But not for long. The next day, another vehicle came, and then another. Word had spread faster than he could imagine. In small towns like this, news moved not through headlines, but through coffee shops and feed stores, through nods exchanged at the gas pump. People were saying the old riverside place was breathing again, that a man was fixing cars there, a quiet fellow with gray in his beard and eyes like someone who had known storms. At first, they came just to look. A mother with her son stopped by and peeked through the half-open door. A retired mailman walked his dog past the lot twice in one morning. 2 teenagers on bikes circled around, whispering and laughing. Michael didn't mind. He waved sometimes, even smiled. He patched a roof tile, rearranged tools, made it look a little less like a ruin and more like a workshop. The change was subtle but real. One afternoon, as he scrubbed grease from his hands, a group of local boys appeared at the doorway. They looked to be 15 or 16, lanky and curious. One of them, wearing a baseball cap backward, asked if he could help out. Michael hesitated. He had never been good with kids, not even with his own when Ethan was that age. But something in their restless energy reminded him of himself long ago, standing in his father's garage, pretending to know how a carburetor worked. He told them they could start by cleaning the floor. They did it clumsily, joking and teasing each other, but when they were done, the place looked brighter. The next day, they returned with rags and polish, asking what else they could do. Michael handed them a box of rusted bolts and told them to sort them by size. It became a ritual. After school, they'd show up, calling him Mr. Reed, asking questions about engines and tools. He taught them how to change oil, how to listen to an engine's rhythm, how to treat machines with respect. He didn't realize it, but in teaching them, he was slowly teaching himself to feel human again. Word of mouth continued to spread. Tom Brady returned, this time bringing a box of old wrenches and a case of filters. "Thought you could use these," he said. "They've been sitting in my barn since '92. Others followed suit. A woman from the diner down the road started bringing him coffee in the mornings, wrapped in a napkin to keep it warm. A farmer dropped off a pile of scrap metal for him to repurpose. Even the pastor from the small Baptist church stopped by to see the miracle mechanic, as someone had called him. Michael didn't know how to handle the attention. He had grown used to being invisible. But as more people stepped into that garage, the walls seemed to shift, the air filling with the quiet hum of community. Laughter returned. The smell of coffee and engine grease blended into something strangely comforting. One Saturday, after finishing work on an old Chevy, he looked up and saw a message scrawled in chalk on the big metal door. The letters were uneven, written by one of the teenagers, probably. Heartbeat Garage. He frowned at first, thinking it too sentimental, but when he went to wash it off, he stopped. The words looked right there, just above the doorway. The next morning, someone had drawn a small heart beside it and underlined it twice. He left it alone. By now, the garage had become more than a place for repairs. People lingered long after their cars were fixed, swapping stories, drinking coffee, helping him sweep or sort tools. Veterans came to talk about old engines from their service days. Mothers came to pick up their sons but stayed to chat. The air felt alive, thick with the kind of warmth that had been missing from the town for years. One evening, while closing up, Michael found an envelope wedged under the door. It wasn't a bill or a note from the city, just a plain white envelope with his name written in neat handwriting. Inside was a letter from someone he hadn't heard from in a long time. His son, Ethan. The letter was short, barely half a page. Ethan had seen a post online. Someone had shared a photo of the Heartbeat Garage, praising the man who'd brought it back to life. He asked if that man was really his father. "If it is you, Dad, I'd like to see you. It's been a long time." Michael sat on the stool by the workbench, the letter trembling in his hands. The walls around him felt suddenly smaller. He read the note again, tracing the lines as if they might change. Outside, the evening light bled into gold, pouring through the cracked windows. For the first time in years, the thought of his son didn't bring only shame. It brought fear, hope, and something else he couldn't name. He wondered what Ethan would see if he came. A broken old man living among engines, or someone who had finally begun to rebuild his life. That night he didn't sleep much. The letter lay beside his cot, the ink catching the weak glow from the hanging bulb. He thought of all the things he'd never said, all the ways he had failed the people he loved. But for the first time, the weight of those failures felt bearable. The garage had taught him that anything could be rebuilt, no matter how broken, if you took your time and used steady hands. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose tin on the roof. Somewhere down the road, a car engine turned over and roared to life, its sound carrying through the dark. Michael smiled faintly in the dim light. Maybe tomorrow or the day after, his son would drive down that same road. Maybe the sound he just heard was a promise, a sign that something long stalled was finally beginning to move again. The letter arrived like a ghost from another life, and for days after Michael found it, he carried it folded in his pocket, smoothing the creases with his thumb every time he thought about opening it again. It wasn't that he didn't remember his son. It was that he remembered too much. The fights, the silences, the day Ethan had packed a single bag and walked out, saying he couldn't watch his father drown anymore. Michael had always told himself it was for the best, that Ethan deserved distance, a future unchained from his father's failures. But now, as he looked around the half-restored garage alive with people, he wondered if maybe this was the one thing he still owed him, a version of himself that wasn't broken. When Ethan finally came, it was on a windy afternoon at the edge of spring. Michael was outside tightening bolts on a rebuilt tractor when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. The sound made him straighten slowly, his back stiff. A car door shut, and footsteps approached, steady but hesitant. When he turned, he saw a tall man in his 30s, dressed neatly but plainly, holding the familiar uncertainty in his eyes that Michael remembered from his own reflection years ago. They didn't rush into words. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, two men connected by blood and silence. The last time Michael had seen his son, he had been angry, tired, and full of pride, the kind of pride that builds walls between people. Now, standing in front of him, Ethan looked cautious but not unkind. "You really fixed this place up," he said quietly, and Michael nodded, the only answer that made sense. That first day was awkward. Ethan walked the length of the shop, studying the old tools, the chalked words, heartbeat garage on the wall, the shelves lined with parts. The boys were there too, the young helpers who'd taken to calling Michael Mr. Reed. They worked silently, pretending not to notice the stranger watching. Michael showed Ethan the rebuilt engines, the generator that powered the lights, the logbook where customers' neighbors now signed their names and left small notes of gratitude. "I thought you were gone for good," Ethan said finally. "Guess I thought so too," Michael replied. It was a small truth, but it hung between them like a fragile bridge. Over the next few days, Ethan began showing up early, sitting on a stool with a notebook while Michael worked. He said little, just watched. Eventually, he started helping sweeping floors, sorting bolts, running to the hardware store. One afternoon, he pulled out a calculator and asked if he could help organize the accounts. The garage, he explained, had become a kind of community workshop, but no one really knew what money came in or went out. Michael shrugged. He'd never cared much about ledgers. "Then let me do it," Ethan offered. "You build. I'll keep track." Slowly, a rhythm formed between them. Michael in the dust and grease, Ethan in the corner with receipts and pencils. They didn't talk much about the past, but the silence between them was different now. No longer a wound, but a space where something new was being built. The teenagers noticed too. They started teasing them both, calling Ethan Junior Boss and asking him to check their math. He took it in stride, even laughed sometimes, and Michael caught himself smiling at the sound. Soon, the garage ran smoother than ever. Ethan suggested small changes, a schedule for repairs, a shelf system for parts, a donation jar near the entrance. He kept track of who brought tools or materials, wrote their names neatly in a ledger, and insisted on thanking them publicly each weekend. What began as a dusty relic was becoming an organized workshop that actually functioned, and people noticed. Cars lined up outside again, not because anyone charged for service, but because the place had become part of the town's rhythm. Farmers brought broken tractors, mothers brought cars that rattled and coughed, kids came with bikes and lawn mowers. Michael would fix what he could, Ethan would write it all down, and by evening they'd sit side by side, exhausted but content. Sometimes Michael would catch his son studying him quietly, as if trying to measure who this man was now. Once, late at night, Ethan said softly, "You look better here, happier." Michael didn't answer. He just kept sanding the rust from an old fender until the metal shone through. By midsummer, the town had started to come alive around the garage. Across the street, a woman reopened a small cafe that had been closed for years, saying the new customers from Heartbeat Garage needed somewhere to eat. A retired carpenter set up a sign for woodworking repairs beside the lot. People began using words like revival and rebirth. The garage had somehow become the spark that reminded everyone what the town could be. The day they restored the old Riverside Auto sign was one of the brightest of that summer. The boys helped scrub off decades of grime, and Tom Brady climbed a ladder to bolt the frame back into place. Underneath it, Ethan painted fresh letters by hand, small but steady, Heartbeat Garage. When the paint dried and the sun hit it just right, it gleamed like new metal. That night, the garage hosted an impromptu celebration. Neighbors brought food, someone played an old guitar, and people filled the space that once echoed only with dust. Michael watched from the doorway, the light spilling out onto the gravel, his son beside him. "You did this," Ethan said. But Michael shook his head. "We did." It was the first time he had said we in years. For the next few weeks, everything seemed steady, almost peaceful. The garage was no longer a refuge, it was a home. Michael had begun teaching Ethan the small, wordless skills of his trade, the way an engine's misfire could be diagnosed by sound, the subtle give of a belt too loose or too tight, the feel of a good wrench balanced in the palm. Ethan was clumsy at first, but eager, and Michael found himself enjoying the process more than he expected. It reminded him of teaching those boys, of passing something forward. But peace, he'd learned, is always temporary. One morning, as the sun rose over the lot, a white envelope appeared in the mailbox outside. It bore the town seal. Michael opened it, expecting some routine notice, but his hands froze as he read. The letter was from the city planning department. The land beneath the garage had been sold to a development firm. Within 30 days, the property was to be cleared for construction, a convenience store and parking lot. He read it 3 times before the words settled in. His stomach dropped. All the laughter, the people, the small miracle they had built here, it would all be gone. He handed the paper to Ethan, who read it silently, his jaw tightening. "They can't just do this," Ethan said. "It's private land." But it wasn't theirs. They'd never owned it. It had been abandoned, forgotten, claimed by time, until someone somewhere decided to make it worth something again. That night, the lights in the garage stayed off. The boys didn't come. The hum of conversation was replaced by the sound of wind moving through the half-open door. Michael sat on a stool with the letter in his hands, staring at the oil-stained floor. He'd lost everything once already, but this was different. This time, it wasn't just his loss. It belonged to everyone who had helped him build this fragile little world. When Ethan came to lock up, he found his father still sitting there, He didn't speak, just set a hand on Michael's shoulder. For a long time, they sat in silence. Outside, the moon hung over the roof, casting a pale light through the cracked windows. The word heartbeat was still faintly visible on the door, drawn in chalk months ago. Michael looked at it for a long time, that fading word that had come to mean everything. "What do we do now?" he asked quietly. Ethan didn't answer. There was no easy answer to give. Somewhere out in the dark, the sound of an engine echoed from the highway, and for the first time since finding this place, Michael didn't know if it meant hope or the beginning of the end. The morning after the letter came, the garage felt heavier, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of what was coming. Michael arrived early, long before sunrise, and sat by the stove without lighting it. The shadows of the tools stretched long across the floor, and the silence pressed in. For the first time in months, he didn't hear the sounds that had become part of his days, the laughter of the boys, the steady rhythm of hammers, the comforting hum of engines brought back to life. Instead, there was only stillness, broken now and then by the rustle of wind against the door. When Ethan came in, he didn't speak at first. He just placed 2 mugs of coffee on the workbench and looked around. The walls that had once seemed proud and strong now looked fragile, like they knew what was about to happen. "We can't let them take it," he said finally, his voice low but certain. Michael didn't answer. He had seen what happens when the world decides something isn't worth saving. Paperwork and money. Those things could crush a man faster than any machine. He had no fight left in him, or so he thought. But the town had other plans. Word spread quickly, faster than before, carried on voices that wouldn't stay quiet. By noon that same day, people began to arrive. Tom Brady was the first, his army jacket soaked from the rain. He came in without a word, holding the notice crumpled in his hand. Behind him came the teenagers, the farmers, the mothers who'd once brought him sandwiches, the old men who used to sit and tell stories. They filled the garage, their faces lined with worry and stubbornness. "They can't just tear this place down," someone said. "Not after all this." Michael stood among them, unsure what to say. He had never asked anyone for anything, not even when he'd lost his first shop or when he'd buried his wife. But as he looked at the faces around him, he realized something had changed. This wasn't his garage anymore. It belonged to them all. Ethan stepped forward more confident than his father had ever seen him. "We'll make them see what this place means," he said. "We'll show them." And with that, the plan began to take shape. They called it One Last Repair Day. The idea came from one of the boys, and everyone agreed instantly. They would open the garage to anyone and everyone. "Bring what you have," they said, tractors, engines, lawn mowers, even toys. Nothing was too small or too broken. Everything would be fixed for free. It would be their way of showing what the Heartbeat Garage truly was. The week that followed was a blur of movement and determination. The teenagers painted signs, bright red letters on scraps of plywood. "Save Heartbeat Garage" and "One Last Repair Day." All welcome. The cafe across the street offered to bring coffee and pies. The local radio station announced the event, and someone even started an online post asking for help. Donations began trickling in: tools, parts, old oil cans, and even cash wrapped in envelopes that simply read, "For the garage." Michael worked harder than he had in years. Every morning he opened the doors before dawn, and every night he closed them long after the last light went out. He repaired the old sign again, cleaned the glass, polished the tools until they gleamed. He didn't dare to hope, but the movement around him was unstoppable. For the first time, the whole town moved with one heartbeat. When the day finally came, the sun rose over the river like a torch. Cars lined the dirt road for half a mile. Families came from nearby towns, some bringing engines in need of repair, others just to lend a hand. The veterans took charge of parking, the teenagers organized tools, the women from the church set up tables with food, the smell of coffee, oil, and baked bread filled the air. Laughter replaced the sound of worry. Every clang of a wrench, every spark from a welding torch felt like a declaration. We are still here. By midday, the garage was alive like never before. A steady rhythm pulsed through it, the hiss of air compressors, the rumble of engines coming back to life, the hum of people working side by side. Michael moved among them, grease on his hands, sweat on his brow, and something fierce in his chest. Every time an engine roared back to life, the crowd cheered. Children clapped their hands. It was more than a day of repairs. It was resurrection. Late in the afternoon, as the golden light began to fade, a black SUV pulled up. The crowd fell quiet for a moment. A man in a pressed suit stepped out, holding a clipboard, the developer's representative. He walked through the crowd, looking around with an expression that was half confusion, half curiosity. When he reached Michael, he extended a hand. "Mr. Reed," he said, "I'm told you're the one responsible for this." Michael nodded warily. The man gestured toward the people working around them. "This wasn't what I expected," he admitted. "They told me the property was abandoned." He paused, his eyes following a young boy tightening a bolt under Tom's supervision. "Doesn't look abandoned to me." For the next hour, the man stayed. He watched the repairs, listened to the laughter, spoke to people who told him stories of what this place had done for them, the veteran who found a reason to get up each morning, the widow whose car was fixed when no one else would help, the teenagers who'd learned to build something with their own hands. By the time the sun began to set, he wasn't holding his clipboard anymore. When he finally turned to leave, he said quietly to Ethan, "There might be another way. I'll talk to my people." He handed over his card and drove off, leaving behind more questions than answers. But for the first time in days, Michael saw something in his son's face he hadn't seen since the letter came hope. That night, when the last car left and the garage grew still again, Michael and Ethan sat by the stove. Outside, the sky blazed with stars, and the wind carried the faint hum of engines cooling down. "You think he meant it?" Ethan asked. Michael didn't answer right away. He poked at the fire, the orange light flickering on his face. "I think he saw what we did," he said finally. "And I think that means something." Over the next few weeks, things moved faster than anyone could have imagined. The developer sent another letter, this time not a threat, but a proposal. They would delay the demolition and allow the community to buy the property if they could raise enough funds. The sum was large, far beyond what Michael had ever seen, but it was something a chance. Ethan took charge, setting up a donation drive online. The story of the garage spread far beyond their small town. News outlets picked it up. Homeless mechanic restores town's spirit, now they're fighting to save it. Money began to pour in from strangers who saw something of themselves in that story. Former residents of the town, veterans, even other small garages sent help. The fight to save the garage became a symbol of something bigger. People from out of state drove in just to shake Michael's hand. Local officials, once indifferent, came to show support. Within a month, they had enough to make the first payment. The town council approved the sale. Heartbeat Garage would belong to the community forever. When the papers were signed, the entire town gathered in front of the building. The old Riverside Auto sign gleamed again, newly painted, and below it, in smaller letters, was a new one, community-owned since 2025. Michael stood beside his son as the mayor handed them the deed. Cameras flashed, people cheered, and for once he didn't look away. He let the pride show. The months that followed were the best of his life. The garage became more than a workshop. It became a school. Ethan helped organize classes for students, teaching them the basics of mechanics and trade skills. Retired men volunteered as mentors, young people found purpose, and the place that had once been silent was now alive every day with laughter, learning, and the steady rhythm of work. Michael no longer slept on a cot in the corner. The townspeople helped build a small apartment above the garage, a modest space with a window overlooking the lot. From there, each morning, he could see the sun rise over the river, shining on the rows of cars and the kids opening the doors. He had never asked for heaven, but this felt close enough. One evening, when the day's work was done, he found one of the younger boys, Justin, quiet and serious, staying late, cleaning tools. Michael watched him for a while, seeing himself in that careful attention, that quiet reverence for the craft. He walked over to his old toolbox, the one that had followed him through every hardship, and opened it. The tools inside were worn but still strong. He handed it to the boy. "These have been through a lot," he said. "Now they're yours. Keep them working." Justin stared at him wide-eyed, too moved to speak. Michael just smiled and turned away, the sound of the boy's soft "thank you" following him across the room. That night, as he stood outside the garage, the neon sign flickered on, casting a warm glow over the lot. The sound of a single engine echoed, a rebuilt Ford from long ago, its motor steady and sure. The air smelled of oil and grass and spring rain. Ethan joined him, standing quietly beside his father, hands in his pockets. "Listen," Michael said. The engine purred, deep and rhythmic. "That's the sound of life," he murmured. "It's not the cars, not the tools. It's us. We fixed ourselves." Ethan nodded, and for a moment neither spoke. The garage behind them glowed softly in the night, its sign shining against the dark sky. The world had taken almost everything from Michael once, but it had given something back, something stronger, built not from steel or gasoline, but from hands, hearts, and second chances. As the engine idled, the town lights shimmered across the river, and the heartbeat garage born from loss, rebuilt through hope, kept on breathing. Its sound rolled through the quiet valley like a promise that would never fade. The man who had once lived in his truck closed his eyes, listening to the pulse of it all, and knew at last that he was home. Don't miss our next story. Hit subscribe right now so you won't miss what happens next. If this story moved you, share it with your friends and let them feel it too. And when you're done, keep watching our other videos. Every one of them hides a story you won't forget.